Welcome to listening to Paint Dry with Mike and Dan, a podcast about the art and hobby of miniature painting. I'm Mike, and thank you so much for joining us on our continued journey to become better, braver, and happier painters. Today we kind of continue our international art party, so to speak. 2 weeks ago we had a conversation with Banshee in Spain. This week we're proud to present a conversation that I had with David Soper, an award-winning artist from the United Kingdom. He's a multi-time Slayer Sword winner and just all-around nice guy. Really enjoyed the conversation, learned quite a bit from what he had to share about his painting journey. You can check him out on Sprocket's Small World, his blog. We'll put links to it in the show notes. The nice thing as well is that he shares his knowledge there and drops some tutorials on everything from weathering to non-metallic metals. He actually has some fantastic recipes that makes life a lot easier if you're studying non-metallic metals, so check it out. So without further ado, I present David Soper. David, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So we got initially, before I didn't hit record, I started asking you about how things were going with the painting in COVID. So I apologize for making you repeat yourself.
No problem. Yeah, I mean, okay. Slightly disrupted. I found it's been a difficult couple of years for various reasons. So it was one more thing on top of everything else. But yeah, it's, you know, painting has been one of my comforts in lockdown. It's ticking along rather than sort of racing. I had assumed, oh yeah, I'm going to get loads and loads of time to paint. There have been a lot of other things going on, but yeah, I've sort of kept it going along, and yeah, it's kept me going as well.
Oh, fantastic. I had the same mentality that student years. I was going to paint a bazillion models. I think I've done 2. You know, just life rolls over.
Yeah, I think a lot of people made that assumption. A lot of people have done a lot of painting. I mean, you see it online. It's sort of slightly terrifying, the amount of work some people are doing.
So tell me how you got into this hobby.
Right. Well, it's a story that goes back a long way, all the way to around about 1980 when I was 14. And it was the big Dungeons and Dragons craze that was going around in the UK at that time. And all my mates were playing in their lunch breaks. I sort of joined in naturally enough. A lot of us were into sort of various, you know, fancy things, Lord of the Rings. We just had the animated cartoon that sort of come round, and a lot of us were reading it at school. And so we were sort of gaming away. And then one day, one of my mates came in from a trip to London. He came back after that, and he had these models with him, these miniatures, which I'd heard about, you know, the miniatures to game with. And I was just totally captured by them. I just saw these little figurines, and I just made this connection. I was already artistic. I already knew that was sort of the kind of thing I was going to pursue career-wise. You know, arts and design was something I was very interested in. Art was my best subject at school. And so the idea of painting these little models just totally clicked with me. And I started doing that, and very quickly that completely took over from the gaming side of things. I was definitely a painter rather than a gamer. And I just fell in love with it. This was the perfect hobby for me. You know, the whole the love of fine detail, the attention to detail was something that I almost struggled with, actually, in all of my painting and drawing. They were far too detailed and finicky. It was a habit that I needed to get out of. And what I actually found was I could pour all of those instincts into my miniature painting where it was completely appropriate. And then that actually freed up my painting and drawing so that I could explore slightly looser and bolder techniques, which was a healthier thing to do in that area. But really, from that point onwards, I just loved, you know, I could happily sit up in my room and sort of paint miniatures in splendid isolation. And sort of did so for, you know, quite a few years. And I was sort of the painter of the group at school. Then a lot of us went on to Sixth Form College, where we ran a little painting club. After a year, I left the Sixth Form and went on to art college, where I was studying graphic design. I was definitely sort of pursuing that artistic side of things, you know, and was focused on a creative career. But the painting was always there, and I found that my miniature painting and my formal art education very much progressed together. But the two things, and even career-wise later on, a lot of my design sensibility, a lot of my color sense. I've developed this with the painting and the graphic design. It's all grown up together. So the painting's been with me for a very, very long time.
That's awesome. I love hearing those stories about how people can kind of, yeah, that artistic side of you in miniatures kind of gave you an outlet that allowed you to explore other things too. So that's very
Yeah,
cool.
yeah,
Um,
it freed me up.
so now, then kind of along that line of being freed up, what did you find when you decided that you wanted to kind of go to that next level of miniature painting? What areas did you kind of struggle in? I know a lot of my listeners always kind of feel alone on an island when they're struggling with painting, but I try to tell them that everybody goes through stuff, you know, with their
Oh,
skills.
yeah. At whatever level you're at, however long you've been doing it, there are always going to be struggles. I think while I was developing, the big thing, it wasn't so much specific techniques. I tended to just sort of explore naturally anyway, but I think I would say it's actually for basics. It's something like brush control. Getting the level of brush control I needed to get the results I wanted has always been and continues to be a struggle. It's the thing I have to work at. You can never take it for granted. Because as I've gained more brush control, more precision, more accuracy, then I've wanted still more from what I'm trying to do. And I think that was really the big thing in learning to paint. I think sort of getting that coordination. I think painting is a habit of coordinating the hands, the eyes, and the brain. It's actually what's happening on the model is almost a byproduct of that coordination working successfully. And it was developing those instincts and those habits that sort of helped me to do that.
That's interesting. It's kind of like developing muscle memory almost, it seems like.
Totally, yeah, yeah. I mean, I found, obviously I sort of did this, and I sort of, you know, as a solo teenage painter, sort of developed these things and explored it. And I had a feeling that I thought I was good, but then I think we all do. And then along came Golden Demon, and it was well, okay, now I'm going to find out, am I as good as I like to think I am? You know, the idea of actually competing was something that came along, and the first Golden Demon came along. And I did pretty well. We had regional heats back in those days in various gaming shops around the country. I didn't get beyond the regional heat, but it sort of spurned me on to sort of think, you know what, there's a challenge here. There's something to aim for now. That sort of gave me more focus to my painting. So then for the next year, I sort of tried again, got through to the finals, won my first trophies, and that sort of kind of got me to really take my painting more seriously. I thought, you know what, I am good. I'm good enough to win things, but you know, you can always be better. We can all always be better. There's always that feeling that, yeah, that could be better every time. And that's really been with me since then. And I sort of then had that sort of struggle, that target of, okay, I've done well, I want to go next year. I want to equal that. I want to keep that standard up. And then there was that Slayer sword hanging before everybody as the ultimate goal, which I managed to achieve shockingly early, really, in 1990. Didn't expect to reach that level so soon. And then kind of reached a stage of almost like, well, okay, I've done that. Now I'm just going to paint for myself. And that's my wilderness years when I sort of disappeared from view in the hobby and just carried on painting for myself for a long time. But eventually, you know, life came along. Other things happened. I sort of stopped painting. And then if we come forward to the early, it won't be around 2010, I think, started painting again, got drawn back into the hobby, and I had a whole new set of challenges because you talked about muscle memory, and I'd lost it. I sort of was seeing all this wonderful stuff online that people were doing and painting, and thinking, I used to do that. I used to be able to do that. I want to do it again. Started trying and just really, you know, couldn't instantly pick up a brush and paint again, which was so disturbing. that sort of disappointment in sort of, oh, dang it, I've lost something here. I could do this, and it frustrated me that I couldn't. But it gave me a real set of challenges. I think that was probably the biggest single, you asked me about what were the challenges I faced while learning. And I think that in many ways, relearning to paint was a much bigger challenge than my initial learning to paint. Because I think when I did it initially, I didn't have the expectations. I was just this sort of kid painting alone, exploring, developing a set of artistic skills, both in his hobby and for his professional life. And yet when I tried to relearn, I had this huge challenge of expecting myself to be able to do it, and expecting myself to be able to do it to a high standard, and having to accept that I was going to have to go back to the basics and sort of relearn the skills, regain that muscle memory. And it took me a few years to do it.
Well, it's amazing too that when you took probably when you took that break, kind of a revolution in the world of miniature painting happened as well while you were gone, right?
Yeah.
Like everything.
I turned my back, and the hobby evolved beyond. I mean, and that was very much the thing that drew me back into it. Back in the old school days, I'd really attained a certain standard, and I think I'd plateaued in the sort of the mid 1990s. And my style was totally of that era, and I'd kind of perfected a style of smooth, bright, crisp painting. And then my style had sort of frozen at that point because I was no longer painting enough to develop. I was maybe doing one miniature a year, for quite a few years. Just every now and again, I'd get something done, and then just stop for a few years. So when I came back, I actually had the double challenge of I had to get back up to speed, almost sort of get back to where I was when I stopped painting. But then there was the really sexy challenge of getting my hobby up to date and becoming sort of a part of and relevant to the modern hobby, because it was so stimulating to see just how much more sophisticated miniature painting had become.
Yeah, it's impressive. Like, let me ask you this: when you came back, have there been, since you've been back, have there been other artists that have inspired you?
Oh, completely. I mean, Ben Comets has been a big inspiration to me. Certainly in those early days when I was seeing what painters were doing and trying to find out, well, how had they done it? Why had they done it? What's the thinking behind this approach? Ben was a massive influence. He was doing a lot of sharing of things online as well, which was so useful to me. Roman Lapat as well, just showing me that kind of a much more fine art sensibility and influence on miniature painting. Back when I learned to paint, it was a very insular sort of hobby. It was very much its own thing within its own little bubble. It had a lot of influences maybe from sort of 1970s fantasy art. Artists like Rodney Matthews, for instance. There was quite a whimsical feel to it. And in the years that passed, there are a lot more real world influences. As I say, fine art, of other types of, historical painting. Those boundaries have blurred tremendously, which I think is all for the better. Between fantasy and historical, the idea of realism. I think even things like the Lord of the Rings films that sort of came in, and suddenly people were painting miniatures, fantasy miniatures of something to which there was a real world reference. Because, prior to that, it's fantasy. It's who's to say I'm painting my space elf in the wrong colors, because you show me a real space elf and then I'll agree with you I've painted it in the wrong colors. But until you do, I'll paint it in whatever colors I think it should be. And then you suddenly had this whole sort of way of painting that had some kind of reference, and that whole kind of grim, dark, that spilled over from the 40K into the fantasy to some degree. A little bit too much, I think, in some respects. But when I came back to the hobby and first started sort of painting and showing my work online, I thought, I want to be a part of this hobby again. And I think, well, actually now there's the internet, which just wasn't there at all when I was painting previously. I suddenly came back to this hobby, and
yeah, the internet was a huge revolution. I remember I'm a 25-year gapper. I played in high school, then I took a 25-year break. And so, yeah, it wasn't even the same planet.
no. It's a different community. You know, I learned to paint. I love the fact that with the internet, there's now a community of painters all around the world that you know, we can share ideas, share our work, critique one another's work. Particularly when I came back into the hobby, it was on the Cool Mini forums, and that was such a help to me, such a support to me, to just kind of, you know, even when you've got all these years of experience, you know, I've been painting for 40 years now, but that doesn't mean I can, sometimes I'll paint something and I'll miss the completely obvious thing. You know, we get so close to our work very often when we paint that we can, you know, you need those fresh eyes when other people, regardless of how experienced they may or may not be, they'll sometimes look at your model and say, yeah, did you mean to do that? What about doing this? And that was just brilliant. That was so useful to me.
It's awesome. Yeah, I love it too. Being able to get that feedback from anywhere in the world is, I don't know, that
Yeah.
it kind of freaks me out sometimes. I'm like, wait, somebody in Germany just
Yeah, it's incredible.
So one of the things I'm always curious about is how artists kind of approach a project. And so if I were to hand you a model, kind of what is your thought process when you go into starting something new?
Right. The first thing I always do with a model is I'm going to look at that model and I'm going to, who is this? What are they? Where are they? I want to just get my head around the identity, the character that I'm painting, the backstory, if there is one. You know, where are they? What are they doing? What's their environment? What are their reasons? And really think it through. And sometimes that's something, you know, that can come very quickly. When I painted Gutrost and I knew who he was and what I wanted to do with him, other models I've had to sort of sit down and think it through a little. And really just so that in my mind I know who I'm painting, what I'm painting. Maybe I'll start looking at some of the more technical ideas. You know, what color palette are we using, which should probably have been informed by, you know, is this a good character, an evil character, is it a magical character? All those considerations that I've already made will then begin to sort of feed into the sort of the color choices, you know, what kind of approach, what texture, is it a dark light? Just thinking about those technical things. And then I may sort of have an even more technical approach. It may be that if it's a model for a workshop, there's something I particularly want to demonstrate on that model. So I'll need to incorporate that into it. Or it may be that there's a particular color I just fancy sort of experimenting with it at that moment. You know, I've had models where I said, you know, on this model, I want to use black. I want to work with black again, or yellow. They're actually two colors that in recent years I've made a particular point of incorporating into a color scheme for more technical reasons, for sort of reasons of I want to sort of you know, experiment with this. But it all has to work together with that story, with that background.
That's, yeah, I was going to actually, one of the other questions I was going to ask was about, do you ever kind of get stuck on a color and maybe go, oh, I've done 5 projects. Damn, that's a lot of green.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say stuck. I have my you know, I have my sort of my yellow period or my green period, which is usually a definite decision to do that. I mean, literally the yellow I was talking about, I did I think I did a Poxwalker where I had these sort of yellow industrial sort of trousers on him, because yellow was a color I suddenly realized I just hadn't used it in any way for years, and I thought, well, what's that about? Let's give it a go. And then I did the Sloppy Ballpiper, where, you know, it's going to be a bright sort of nurgly, chaosy yellow. So I like to play with a specific color and see how, you know, how I can push it in different directions. And I like to explore a color and, you know, how does it react in different situations against other colors? And I'll have definite periods and eras where I do that. Getting stuck on a color, I do have favorite colors. I catch myself using maybe a little too much. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I actually think it's really good. You know, as an artist, I think you need to understand the pigments you're working with, how they behave in different situations, on different types of model with different color combinations. If you take this color and mix it with that color or that color, how will it behave? And I think as a painter, I think that's part of my skill set, that I need to sort of have that understanding. There are certain colors I have that are definite favorites, but every now and again, I think it's really important to just shake it up and forbid myself to use certain colors on certain projects. So, you know what, I'm not doing that this time. When I did Gut Rot Spume, I used a completely fresh palette. I'd actually shifted to a new range of paints. I'd started using Pascal color paints for the first time, and I said, you know what, I really need to focus on this, and I really need to experiment. So I'm going to use entirely Pascal color paints. So none of these colors were familiar, and I mean the result. It took me out of my comfort zone. It forced me to explore, and I mean it was one of the most complicated color palettes I've ever worked with, because I was sort of introducing colors and trying them in certain combinations, and some would work, some wouldn't. Some I'd use, I think that's nice, but I need a bit of this, I need a bit of that. Then other times I may have a model where I think, you know what, I'm going to use the old favorites because I know exactly what they're going to do. I think the best is a combination of both worlds. I think have your old favorites, have the colors that you know exactly how to use them, how they're going to behave, but throw a couple of new colors into the mix, so you gradually expand your repertoire, your understanding of how these colors are going to behave. Because obviously, when we're working with paint, we're using pigment, and pigments can behave quite strangely when you intermix them. It's different to just pure color theory of, the relationships between the various colors. When you actually sort of bring pigment into it as an issue, you can discover, an example I often use actually is the old color Scorched Brown, which I love deeply. It looks like a fairly ordinary dark brown, but there's actually a lot of red in it. You don't necessarily see that red. If you just paint a square of Scorched Brown onto a piece of paper, you won't necessarily realize how much red is in that color until you start to use it and mix it with other colors. And this is something I found on my Dark Elder diorama from 2013. I was mixing Scorched Brown with some pale blues, and I was getting purpley tones out of it, which is how I came to realize just how much red was hidden in there. And that's lovely, because you can really start to play with the pigments you're using and sort of get some quite interesting results out of them.
Right. Now, let me add this kind of follow-up with that, because you had mentioned Ben Comets as being one of your influences. The two paints that you always see in Ben Comets, dark sea blue and tank brown.
Yeah.
Is there anything that's in your repertoire that you kind of, besides Scorched Brown per se, is there another color or anything that kind of seems to always make its way onto your palette?
Oh, but there certainly are. There's a skill color called Black Leather, which I love. It's a strange color. It's a very dark desaturated brown, but there's almost something purple about it.
Yep.
And I don't know how you can have a purpley brown, but there is. But it's one of, I think these colors I like, they're almost for sort of the more desaturated colors that are often in that slightly muddier area. But what I find with that color is you can mix it with almost any other color to darken it, and it won't mess it up too much. I mean, even yellow to a degree. I mean, yellow's a notoriously tricky one, but I find that I can use this Black Leather to shade most other colors successfully, be they warm or cool. Which is wonderful. I mean, dark sea blue is a little like that. Obviously, it's got those blue-green pigments in it, which can be quite overpowering. You have to be a little more careful with that one. Another one I use an awful lot of is Flayed One Flesh, which I tend to use as a highlight color. For similar reasons. It doesn't overwhelm a color scheme. It's not pure white. I don't like to use pure white as a highlight color anymore. I always like to sort of keep that for the extreme highlights. What I find is that you paint a model and you use a color like Flayed One Flesh, which is actually quite a yellowy off. It's not even off white. It's definitely a cream tone. And really, when you see the model, you don't miss the white. You don't realize it's not there, but then you've got that further step, that little pop of contrast that you can always add, those little white sort of pings in the highlights. I think this is actually, it's probably this in many ways, is how Ben has been a particular influence to me when I came back to the hobby. This idea of what I refer to as global highlight and shade colours, which is this idea of having a highlight colour which is in all your mixes for all your colours, be that a tiny amount or a huge amount. And the same that all my shadow colours would have the same, for example, the dark sea blue or the black leather, all my shadows would have that in there to some degree in the mix, which really ties together a colour scheme in a wonderful way. That was, I think, the single biggest revelation I had when I came back to painting, because prior to that, if I painted a red area, I would shade it with a dark red. You know, I would highlight it probably with white, to be honest. In those days, I highlighted everything with white, but maybe green's a better example. You know, I would go from a bright light green through to a dark green, and within that green area, all my colours would just be green. There would be no other colour in the shadows or the highlights, which creates a very you know, it's a thing, and there's nothing wrong with it. But it creates quite a comic book sort of look to a model. That very, very high fantasy, not really very realistic. I mean, people often look at my work, and one of the comments I often get is there's a bit of a comic book feel to my work, which I think, yeah, that's probably actually the graphic designer in me. That's part of my style. When I used to do illustration, and I didn't illustrate in a super photorealistic. There was always that little bit of stylization and in my work, and I think that comes through into my painting. But increasingly, I found by having this sort of unifying force in my color scheme. So that's where my favorite colors tend to actually come into play. Racar Flesh is another one. I often use that as a base color, and then often will pull that back into the mix of my colors, sort of in those midtones towards the highlights. If I'm using Rakoff as the base, that will always be in there, and just to unify it all.
That Rakoff Flesh is very similar to one of my crutches, Deck Tan from Vallejo. I use that. Yeah. They're very close in that kind of temperature and color scheme. So, yeah, that's also awesome. That that universal highlight thing is certainly something that is I've adapted to too. I love it. It makes my life a lot easier. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. I don't have to worry. Like, I don't sit there and have to go triad, or do I have to do, because triads are helpful and are a good way to learn to paint, but taking it to the next level, you're right, is kind of, using greens to shade red, or, and I actually use that brown leather, or that black leather color a lot too. I was really surprised when I first put it on my palette. I'm like, there is nothing black about this color.
Oh, not in any way whatsoever. Yeah, it is a strange color, but it's so useful.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that's evolved in your painting is that now you're teaching classes as well. What prompted you to want to teach?
Initially, I was sort of pressured into it. I just had a lot of people asking me, "Will you do a class? Will you do it?" No. I couldn't possibly do that. And eventually, I sort of yielded. I thought, well, I'll give it a go. It was, I was sort of tempted by the idea of doing it. I thought it could be a good thing to do. A lot of people are asking me to do it, and found I loved it. I loved that. I think that interaction was so good, just to be able to go and meet up with a group of painters and share what I do, and get as much back from the group as I'm giving to them as well, which is something I hadn't anticipated. I'd always had this vision of, well, I'm going to have to stand there and teach, and it is a two-way process. But I think that the best workshops are always the ones when you get as much back from the group and people contribute. And I enjoyed. I found I actually enjoyed preparing the workshop as well. Once I'd sort of broken the ice and done my first one, I can there's a lot of thought and planning and preparation that goes into it. I think that's the graphic designer in me. I love that idea of thinking a thing through, of how are we going to approach this? What's the solution going to be? Here's a problem. Let's come up with a solution. Well, the problem is, how am I going to explain how to do what I do? And actually, in many ways, I think the thing it's made me analyze what I do, because I'd reached a point in my painting where I was almost running on instinct. I'd say I've had 40 years of sort of painting on and off now. And it's almost to the point of you don't consciously think about what you're doing. And then suddenly I have to explain that to a group of people and show them in such a way that they hopefully can sort of, take some of that on board themselves. And it's really made me analyze and understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing things. And I think the difference now is I don't necessarily, I still tend to run, when I'm painting, it's a very fluid, very organic process. I'm not thinking I need to introduce a warmer color here. I'll just think, I want a bit of brown. But when I then step back and look at what I'm doing and why I can analyze it and understand what I think, we need to, So, painting was teaching in workshops as really sort of opened out my hobby for me quite a bit.
Well, you kind of answered the next question too. I was going to ask you how that impacted your painting. That's fantastic. I love hearing how teachers, people who teach get so much out of it as well. That's kind of.
Yeah, no, I just, I think, I really hadn't anticipated how it's a great feeling. It's that sharing, which I think is important. Once my first ever workshop, when I did it, we sat down, we did the introductions. I'd prepared everything, but I'd never been to a workshop myself. So I was sort of thinking, oh God, I hope I'm getting this right. Picked up, I thought, well, this isn't going to do. Get a grip, get on with it. Started doing it, but then just that sort of, the appreciation is nice. I mean, I guess there's a bit of an ego trip involved in teaching, but it was lovely. Just the fact that, people would make suggestions, we discuss painting. That's some of the best bits of a workshop, actually, the bits that while I've done my bit, and people are sort of working away on the model. I like to get as much practical time in a workshop as possible. I want people painting in my workshops as much as they can, less of me, talking at them, more of them, painting, and then I can go around and we can talk about more. It's great. We can talk about, as a group, we can have these wonderful discussions about which benefit from that, just as much as the me teaching them the specifics of how I stipple a model, for example.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, the learning from not only that, you foster kind of a community in that room. That's how my co-host and I met, was from taking classes, so that's an awesome thing for sure. Now, I want to get a little specific because you're recently, I'm not sure if you finished it yet or not, but you're working on one of my favorite Games Workshop models, which is the Castellan robots.
Yep, he's done, he's finished, yeah.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how you approach that, because I know an area that I struggle with is something like weathering. It's either too little, that why'd I waste my time, or holy crap, that's way too much on the model. And so I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about trying to find balance and such, because your robot's fantastic. I love it. I actually have a bunch of pictures saved on it to look at it for future reference material for me.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. I mean, that's a really tricky issue. I mean, I struggle with it myself. I mean, anything like that, actually. I mean, I'm quite well known for adding microbeads and slime effects to models. And it's a similar thing to the weathering. And it's so easy to go over and do too much. And I often do. Even highlighting a model, I'll often over-highlight models. It's been something I've always done in my painting. And getting that balance, knowing when to stop, is really tricky. It's actually, this relates to something I was taught at art college, and there are two real danger points in a project. And the first one is just starting the damn thing. There's nothing more daunting than a black piece of paper or an unpainted model. It's just taking it and starting and making those first marks and committing. That can be quite a struggle. But also then knowing when to stop. Have I done enough? What is it good enough? Have I, is it clear enough? Have I conveyed all the things I need to convey in this project? Have I achieved the right level of contrast and balance? And have I weathered it enough? Actually knowing when that happens is really tricky. I mean, personally, it's a gut instinct thing again. I mean, but also, there's a lot of to and fro, and I'll often paint something and think, I've got to knock that back now. It's not being afraid to change for work. That, this isn't this sort of process where you start painting and you just have to sort of steamroller through the project until the end. There's going to be a lot of back and forth. I mean, my painting is always a very organic process of going back and forth. I will try something, I'll commit to, right, I'm going to add this rust effect here, with the understanding that it may not work, and I may well have to then knock it back, or even, God forbid, completely overpaint it and redo it. So, I mean, I'm a careful painter, I guess. I'm a notoriously slow painter. I do a lot of thinking. I do probably more thinking about my projects than I do painting. I certainly spend longer looking at them on the shelf above my desk than I do having them in my hand painting them. I like to spend a little while or work on a model, and then I'll set it aside and look at it, move it around a bit, look at it in different light, think about the next step. Do I need to add something? Is that right? Is that finished? Before I then, the next day or later that day, I'll pick it up again and maybe just do another little 10 minutes, half an hour, an hour's painting, whatever. But just very slowly, very carefully, sort of work it through. But it's tricky. I will always have a plan. I think it's important to actually start out with a sense of where you want to finish. You may not finish there. I mean, plans always change. Mine certainly do. But with the Castellan, as an example, that model was being painted to demonstrate weathering effects. So I thought, I'm going to go in pretty heavy with this guy. I'm going to really, weather him up much more than maybe my instinct. But I made that decision before I started. I was going to do a lot of weathering, which helped. It gave me a little bit more confidence. But yeah, it sort of knowing when to stop is so important.
Do you keep a notebook, or how do you keep track of where you want to go with the project, or like color schemes, etc.?
Yeah, I do keep a notebook. It's not something I've always done. Certainly, and specifically, I've been doing the workshops. I now have a notebook, and I'll set aside a few pages for each project, and I will start off by actually sort of, I will make some initial notes about, and it may be that I'll spend several weeks or even months thinking about, that initial thinking stage. I was saying earlier about, who is this character? Where are they? What are they doing? All those things will go in my notebook. And then also any thoughts I have about color schemes, the types of contrast, the types of texture, any special effects, lots of little technical things like that. I'll just write them all down because, the ideas may come to me at any point in the day. And it's typical that you think, oh yeah, I must do that, and then you forget. So I always make a note of it. What I did specifically with the Castellan, actually on the bottom of the page, I literally just painted a whole load of little color swatches in what I thought my color scheme would probably be. I mean, I'll often try and think a color scheme through, bearing in mind the atmosphere and the story, and then also using color theory. The first thing I normally do is just get the pots out and stick them on my desk and see those pots of color next to each other. And if there's a real stinker in the mix, I can usually sort of fish it out straight away. Then, paint them actually, because obviously the paint in the pot is different to the paint on the surface, but, just paint them down next to one another to see those colors as a group. So I've got that there as a note and reminder, but then as the project progresses and ideas occur to me, I will always make a point of writing things down because my projects can sometimes take me months, and usually take me months, let's be honest. I might be sort of painting one bit of a model, but suddenly I'll think, I'm painting the leg, but I might think, oh, I could do this on the head. But I'm not going to be painting the head for a few weeks. So I always write those things down. And, it doesn't have to be in any great detail. They're little sort of, often they're one word sort of memory joggers. But it's been really helpful. But I do like to work in a planned way, a thoughtful way. I think because I've had a design training, the idea of thinking through a creative solution to a challenge is something that's very much sort of embedded in my miniature painting. But again, if you've got a plan, then you can vary from that plan. You've got a structure you can work from. I think it's important not to be too slavish. You have to be flexible. You know, sometimes you're painting something, you might get a better idea halfway through a project, simply because you've been working with a certain set of colors or a certain type of texture, and you might suddenly get that moment of inspiration, and it might be better, you know. So you've got to be willing to be flexible. I think having a plan gives you that sort of flexibility. You know, you need the structure to work from. If you just start doing it and making it up as you go along, which I've sometimes joked is my method of working, it isn't really. You know, I've always got an idea in my head or a plan written down somewhere, but that's my starting point. And some models, they finish, as I said, Gut Rot Spume is an example of pretty much exactly what I thought about at the start, is almost exactly what the model looks like. Most other models, the final result will vary in some way from my initial concept, but it's grown organically.
Yeah, I love that model too, and that's one of the things that I think when that is one of the first models that I think about when I think about your work, because I think about it and I see so many different potential stories with him on the the bow of the ship, and I'm saying, like, is he going to conquer on his way to or from conquering and decaying the rest of the, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah. That one was, I mean, it was incredible. I mean, I saw that we were at not Games Day, we were at the Warhammer Fest, and they literally just launched the model, and he was in the cabinets. I think they had the studio model painted up, and the moment I saw him, I saw him, and I knew I wanted him on the prow of the boat, and I pretty much knew the sort of color palette I wanted to do, and I've never had that before or since. To be that clear with what I wanted, but that sense of the story around the guy, I mean, that was a dream project. It all came together, and then obviously I had to do it. But to start out with such a clear idea is quite unusual. Normally I do have to sort of work them through a little bit.
It's really an impressive piece. We'll put links to it in the show notes so everybody can get a chance to look at it and just gawk at it like I do. One of the next questions I wanted to ask you was, now you paint a lot of Games Workshop models, but is there a model out there that hasn't been made that you want to see made? Like, I always use the example of the Stephen King's Dark Tower series. I'd love to see miniatures based on the main characters of that. Is there anything out there that you would like to see and like to paint?
I think so, yeah. Not so much from a particular sort of film or book or anything, but I mean, something I really like painting elves. In amongst all my Nurgle stuff and my Chaos stuff, you'll find throughout my painting history, you regularly get elves of various sorts, and I've never yet seen a range of elves that really capture for me the sort of the wild, sort of inhuman, magical feel that I just have a gut feeling that I want some real kick-ass, almost alien feeling elves. I think Games Workshop are starting to get there. I think there's a slight weirdness creeping in now, that they're going for a much more high fantasy approach. I would love some elves that were really sort of wild, magical, strange. We're beginning to get these figures that are sort of levitating up with the sort of the magic they're using, robes flowing around them, much more sort of elemental. Some of the strange sort of mutations that they're creating with some of their sort of elves and their spin-offs from the elves as well. I think it's going in a really good direction. I think it could go further. The one that I think comes closest, so I've got sort of in my great pile of unstarted projects, is Alariel. I think she sort of, the moment I saw that figure, I thought, yeah, that's going towards what I want to see in an elf. Just that much more ethereal and inhuman feel to them. I think Tolkien had a huge sort of influence on elves for a very long time. And I've nothing against Tolkien's elves at all. I love Tolkien's work, but I think in sort of miniatures for a long time, they were just sort of tall, slim, pointy-eared humans.
Right. Now, Alariel's the one that rides the beetle, right?
That's it, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that's an incredible model. I hope you do get to paint that. That'd be very cool to see your take on that. The motto of our podcast is better, braver, happier. Is there any advice that you could give our listeners to help them along that journey?
Yeah, I think definitely picking up on the braver element. I think don't be afraid to fail. It's really important. You have to be willing to sometimes fail to learn. We all run into trouble in our painting projects. We all have those tricky moments. Things go wrong. And I've seen a lot of painters, they reach that moment and they kind of give up. They kind of stop. They let it defeat them. And you have to learn to be able to work through that. Sometimes you need to put the model aside, and not every day is a painting day. And sometimes you take a break from it. You don't go there, but you don't abandon it. And one of the things I sort of came to sort of try to share in my workshops is that understanding that I think the really big difference between an experienced painter and an inexperienced painter is that the experienced painter knows they will get it wrong and they will run into trouble at various points in a project. And they have the confidence and experience to work it through, to come to a resolution. Whereas if you're a bit less experienced, you can get daunted by that. So you need to be brave. You need to sort of embrace the mistakes, because to be honest, you're going to learn a lot more from painting a model where things go wrong, and you stick with it and you work it through, and you maybe talk to other people about it. If you're really hitting a wall, you get some other viewpoints. But at the end of the day, you'll have learned far more from that. If you get it finished, see it through to the end. Don't give up. But yeah, don't be afraid of problems. They happen to everybody. Every single thing I've ever painted, there's going to be a time on that project when something's not gone right, and I've had to struggle with it and come to a resolution.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. It's been an honor, David. I'm a huge fan of your work, and I'm looking forward to continuing to following you.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Dan and I would like to thank David Soper for joining us on today's show. What a fantastic interview. We learned quite a bit from talking to him. Please check out his blog at Sprocket's Small World. We will have a link to it in the show notes. We'll also have a link to his social media, such as Instagram. David, thank you so much for sharing your journey with us. It certainly was educational, and we really, really appreciate it. You're welcome back here anytime. You can follow us at Listening to Paint Dry at Instagram and on Facebook, also on Twitter at Dry Painting. You can also email us if you have any comments, concerns, questions, thoughts about the show, any feedback you want to give us. You can email us at listeningtopaintdry@gmail.com. Additionally, you can like, subscribe, follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Please, if you get an opportunity to give us a good review, we greatly appreciate it. Every little bit helps move the podcast up. And so thank you so much. We'll be back again in 2 weeks with another episode. And sometimes you just got to trust your gut to become a better, braver, happier painter. Until next time. Listening to Paint Dry with Mike and Dan is a production of LTPTWMD. All rights reserved. No portion of this recording may be used without the express written consent of the host. The music is Death by a Thousand Questions by Springtide. Download from the Free Music Archive on a non-commercial attribution share-alike basis. All views and opinions expressed in the show are solely the views and opinions of the person who said them. All celebrity voices, if any, were impersonated and done so poorly.